Smoke rose like a slow prayer from the valley floor. It wound its way through the chill of dawn, a ghost's breath ascending to a sky already heavy with the scent of iron and rot. Dew clung to the helmets of weary men, glimmering like the last traces of innocence before the sun's awakening. Along the ramparts, sentinels stood motionless, not from courage, but from exhaustion too deep to feel fear. Below, the enemy's camp stirred. Fires crackled faintly in their pits. Silhouettes moved with quiet purpose. To the watchers on the walls, it seemed another morning of waiting, of listening to distant hammering and whispered orders. Yet beneath that calm rhythm of labor, something dreadful was being born. All night, the sound had carried up from the valley, the groan of timber, the ring of iron, the mallets striking like slow heartbeats. They were building something vast, something that breathed cruelty. The carpenters worked without laughter, shaping beams torn from the forest, bones of trees now repurposed for war. What rose in the shadows was no simple engine of siege. It was a creature of vengeance, a trebuchet large enough to hurl death itself. They whispered its name among themselves, the dragon of Saint Othmar, and some spat after speaking it, as though to ward off blasphemy. It would not merely cast stones. It would fling the swollen corpses of oxen, rotted and reeking, gifts of plague wrapped in hide. Each carcass was a prayer for the enemy's slow death. Inside the fortress, the air was stale with unspoken dread. The priest walked the battlements at dawn, his fingers trailing across the cold stones as he murmured Latin verses into the mist. Miserere nobis, miserere. His voice trembled not with devotion, but with weariness. The bread was hard now, the water fouled. The well had turned bitter days ago, though no one dared confess it aloud. To admit corruption was to invite panic, and panic was a quicker killer than hunger. In the narrow streets below, mothers scraped mold from crusts of bread. Children coughed in their sleep, thin bodies twitching under rags. Rats had become bolder, scuttling over sleeping limbs in search of crumbs. The men, once proud defenders, now looked to the sky more than to their spears, waiting, not fighting. Every evening, the same silence fell. It was not peace. It was the sound of a people listening for the next sound of doom. When the first shot came, it arrived not as thunder, but as stillness. For a moment the air itself seemed to vanish, a pause too long, too perfect. Then the impact, a crack like the breaking of a world. Stone shattered, dust rose in a holy column. A tower shuddered, bent, and folded inward like parchment in flame. The first to die did not scream. They were too close. Their bodies became part of the dust, part of the stone, part of the memory that no one would dare speak. Those who ran toward the collapse found only fire, the splintered remains of timber, the faint outline of those who had once stood there. Then the second shot came, and the third. Pitch barrels burst in the courtyard, spraying fire like a new sun. Sparks danced upon armor, kissed the edges of banners, ignited the siege ladders they had hoped to use for salvation. The screams that rose then were not human in shape. They were hymns for no god in particular, voices twisted by terror and smoke. From a distance, it might have seemed beautiful, a vision of divine judgment rendered in light and ruin. The arcs of flame, the falling stones, the silhouettes of men caught between courage and despair. It all played out like some grand choreography, written not in ink, but in ash. But inside the walls, beauty was the first casualty. The priest stumbled through the chaos, robes singed, clutching his crucifix like a weapon. He found the chapel doors torn from their hinges. The icons lay shattered, their painted eyes blackened by soot. He fell to his knees amid the ruin and whispered, Deus absconditus, the hidden god. Somewhere beyond the flames, the bells began to ring. No one had pulled the rope. The fire had reached the tower, and the heat bent the bronze until it cried out on its own. By mid-afternoon, the fortress had become a furnace. Men no longer fought for glory, only for air. The wounded crawled to the wells, found only sludge, and drank anyway. A soldier's sword rusted where he had dropped it in the mud, its blade still warm from the grip of his dying hand. The trebuchet, down in the valley, creaked with patient rhythm. Each swing was slower now, more deliberate, as though savoring the ruin it brought. When its next burden flew, an ox carcass bloated and bursting mid-air, it broke open above the walls. A black rain followed. Blood, filth, and the beginnings of pestilence. The defenders watched it fall and did not even move. Despair had dulled their sense of disgust. Night felt like mercy. The fires smoldered down to embers. The screams faded to whispers. Ash lay thick upon every surface, on lips, on armor, on the pale faces of the dead. The moon rose, calm and detached, glinting faintly on the blackened stones. A boy wandered through what had once been a courtyard. He carried a bucket too large for his hands, seeking water he knew he would not find. His feet left soft prints in the ash, as though he were walking through snow. Near the chapel, he found the priest seated against a wall, eyes open but unseeing. In his lap lay a page torn from scripture, burned along the edges. The boy could still make out a single line. Itiarunt bella usque ad finem mundi, and there shall be wars until the end of the world. He folded the paper, placed it in his tunic, and kept walking. Somewhere above, the trebuchet shadow turned again toward the sky. Down in the valley, the enemy's soldiers feasted. The smell of roasting meat drifted upward, mingling with the scent of death. One of them, a carpenter who had built the great engine, sat apart from the others, hands still raw from labor. He watched the fortress crumble in the moonlight and felt no triumph. Only fatigue, only the hollow ache of men who have done what they were told. He whispered a prayer of his own, not for forgiveness, but for forgetfulness, for the mercy of sleep without dreams. The wind shifted, carrying with it a soft, distant sound, not of battle, but of weeping. It came from the fortress walls, where survivors moved like shadows, gathering the remnants of their lives. The carpenter looked toward the sound and felt something stir within him, small and fragile. Pity, perhaps, or recognition. The same hunger, the same fear, only separated by stone. He rose, turned his back to the fire, and walked toward the darkness beyond the camp. Behind him, the trebuchet groaned once more, preparing another throw. Its rope strained, its arm lifted, patient as death. In the fortress, the boy looked up at the moon and thought it beautiful, too beautiful for such a night. He did not yet understand that beauty, in such times, was a cruelty of its own. He only knew the silence that followed destruction, the stillness that comes when there are no more prayers left to speak. The moat had frozen over that winter, a smooth, glassy bridge between hunger and deliverance. Beneath its surface, fish hung motionless, entombed in ice like the castle's last saints. Above, the wind howled through arrow slits, carrying the dry whisper of prayers that no longer had strength to rise. For weeks, no bird had crossed the sky. No fire dared show itself after dusk. The siege had ground both sides into silence. And then, across that glacial expanse, the enemy began to move. They came as shadows upon the pale mirror, each breath visible, each heartbeat a gamble. The ice cracked faintly beneath their boots, a sound as delicate as parchment tearing. From the walls, the defenders watched without a word, their torches dimmed to embers, their hands too numb to tremble. There was no shouting, no rallying cry, only the quiet disbelief of men who had outlasted hope and now faced something stranger than death. Rumors had reached them in whispers before the snows came, of a new invention, a devil's trick. An iron serpent that spat fire, its breath fed by black powder and oil. It was said to be carried by two men, its fuse trembling like a snake's tongue before the strike. Few believed it. War already had enough demons without inviting more. But that dawn, the rumor walked out upon the ice. At first, there was only mist, the kind that turns dawn into a dream. Then, a sound unlike any known weapon. Not the clash of swords, not the twang of bowstrings. It was a scream, not of man or beast, but of something born of both. It split the morning clean in two. A moment later, the world ignited. A rolling wave of fire unfurled across the ice, alive and ravenous. It moved with purpose, a creature of liquid flame, crawling, hissing, devouring. The moat, once frozen solid, became a burning mirror, red and gold, swallowing men whole. The air itself seemed to burn, alive with the sound of things dying. Those who fell didn't scream. The fire stole their voices first. Their silhouettes sank through the molten surface, disappearing into the fire beneath the ice. The flames licked across their shields, climbed the walls, danced upon the ramparts. Snow turned to steam, stone to soot. Inside the keep, chaos was quiet. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. The air grew thick, alive with a taste of oil and death. Smoke clawed through the narrow slits meant for arrows, dragging its fingers along the walls. Candles wept black tears. The chapel bell, warped by heat, gave one last fractured toll before silence reclaimed it. And still, the lord of the fortress stood unmoving before his window. His armor caught the light of the burning moat, a cold mirror of damnation. The fire reflected in every rivet, every joint. His face, half hidden beneath the visor, was carved in stone. For days, he had prayed for deliverance, for an end that did not dishonor the walls his father built. Now deliverance had come, but not from heaven. Behind him, a monk's quill scratched feverishly. The air trembled with his writing, Latin words gasping for meaning. He recorded what he saw, though no scripture had prepared him for this. A serpent of iron breathing fire upon the frozen blood of men. Diabolus spiravit per homines, he wrote. The devil has learned to breathe through men. In the courtyard below, snow melted in uneven patches, revealing the footprints of the living and the ash of the dead. The wounded moaned softly, not for mercy, but for the return of the cold. For the cold was clean. The fire, though distant now, lingered in the air, a ghost that would not leave. By nightfall, the siege was over, not because one side triumphed, but because both had seen something they could not name. The attackers, victorious and terrified, withdrew from the smoldering ice, dragging the iron serpent behind them. Its metal shell hissed and smoked, as if the weapon itself resisted being silenced. They said its breath was born of Greek fire, an ancient formula stolen and reforged. But to those who watched it burn across the moat, it was not chemistry. It was possession. Inside the keep, the Lord ordered the gates barred, though no enemy remained. He stood before the altar, his sword laid beside a relic, a splinter of bone said to belong to a saint. For a long time he said nothing. The stone floor beneath him was warm, too warm, as if the earth itself had begun to remember what hell felt like. In the stillness that followed, no one slept. The monks whispered that night about prophecy, of mankind learning to command the breath of dragons, of turning nature itself into an accomplice of war. One young scribe, his ink frozen halfway down the page, asked if such a thing could ever be unlearned. The elder gave no answer. He simply closed the manuscript and prayed over the ink before it dried. Outside, the snow returned, but it was no longer white. It fell black, flakes of ash drifting like dead moths upon the ramparts. It landed gently upon the walls, hissing faintly as it met the frost. In the valley below, silence gathered again. Only the faint crackle of cooling metal broke the stillness. And there it was, the serpent itself. Its mouth still glowed, faintly red beneath the soot. Steam rose from its belly. It seemed to sleep, but not peacefully. Its shape half buried in the snow, looked almost human, as if the weapon had inherited the sins of its makers. One soldier approached it, curious or cursed, none could tell. He reached out and touched the metal. It burned his skin even through the glove. He drew back with a hiss, leaving a piece of himself behind on the iron. For a moment, the serpent seemed to sigh, a soft exhalation through its vents, as though dreaming of its next breath. Above, the moon broke through the cloud, pale and trembling. It touched the scorched ice, turning it silver again. The moat shimmered with reflections, ghosts of the fallen moving just beneath the surface, forever walking that glass bridge between hunger and deliverance. In the morning, the castle would awaken to new rules of war. The age of swords and shields had taken its first step into fire. Those who survived would tell stories of a day when the world's cold heart melted, when men saw for the first time that the weapon was not forged against them, but from them. The monks sealed their chronicles. The Lord buried the dead without songs. The children, when they dreamed of the fire beneath the ice. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in another camp, two men knelt beside a second serpent, smaller, quieter, its fuse coiled and waiting. They did not speak. Only the wind moved, whispering through the reeds, carrying the faint scent of smoke. The world was changing, and with it, the silence between wars would never sound the same again. The storm came without mercy. Rain fell like spears upon the earth, each drop slicing through the darkness, whispering secrets into the mud. The battlefield shimmered under the silver torrent, a wasteland of broken stakes and drowned banners. In that cold deluge, men became shadows, bent backs, silent lips, trembling hands. They worked not for glory, but for the slow birth of something unseen. Beneath that veil of rain, torches flickered against the wind, revealing faces hollowed by exhaustion. Their armor was mud, their prayer, the rhythm of their shovels. Every strike into the soil was both a defiance and a confession. They were not soldiers now. They were grave diggers of stone. The trench wound its way through the storm, a serpent of purpose and dread. The commander's voice, low, strained, half swallowed by thunder, guided them, deeper, quieter. The earth must not speak our intent. And so they obeyed, descending into darkness, until the rain became a distant memory, a heartbeat pounding through the soil above. Candles flickered against the walls of the narrow shaft. The flame quivered, hungry for air. The men crouched in the tunnel, their breath forming pale ghosts in the stagnant dark. The pickaxe's ring was the only sound, a dull rhythm swallowed by clay. One man hummed softly under his breath, a tune his mother once sang by the hearth. It steadied him. It steadied them all. They called this work the undermining. To hollow the ground beneath the enemy's fortress. To turn the earth itself into a weapon. A single spark would devour foundations, stones, and men alike. The plan was simple, at least on parchment. But here, under the weight of the world, simplicity was a myth. The air thickened with dust and fear. Timber groaned overhead, sweating with moisture. Water dripped in a slow, eternal rhythm, a metronome counting down to catastrophe. The men dug on, faces streaked with blackened sweat, whispering prayers that the ceiling above would hold another hour, another minute. Above them, the fortress loomed, a beast of iron and limestone. Its towers pierced the clouds. Fires glowed through arrow slits, dim and watchful. Within those walls, the garrison laughed to hide their unease. They felt something stirring beneath them, a tremor soft as breath, then gone. The commander ordered the minstrels to play. "Let the songs drown the silence," he said. But silence has a way of listening. Back in the tunnels, the miners reached the heart. A chamber hollowed from the bedrock, its walls reinforced with timber beams blackened by oil. They carried down bundles of dry wood, pitch, and straw. The smell of resin filled the air, sharp, flammable, final. One man knelt before the pile and pressed his hand against it, as if feeling the pulse of the coming fire. He whispered, "May the earth forgive us." There was no grandeur here, no fanfare of conquest, only the quiet understanding that when the torch met the pitch, none of them would be remembered. The victors above would claim the triumph. The chroniclers would write of siege and bravery, but not of the nameless hands that clawed the underworld to bring down a wall. Their reward would be silence, their names dissolved in mud. And yet they believed in something, perhaps in revenge, perhaps in survival, perhaps only in the stubborn need for the war to end. They were men who had lost the light long ago, both above and below. Hours passed. The rain eased, but the sky remained the color of iron. In the fortress courtyard, soldiers gathered near the chapel. The priest spoke softly, blessing them before the dawn's assault. None noticed the faint vibration beneath their boots. None saw the thin cracks spreading through the flagstones like veins of ice. Deep below, the torch was lowered. The flame caught the oil-soaked straw, a serpent of fire uncoiling in the dark. It hissed, then roared. The air ignited. A blast of light filled the tunnel, white, blinding, eternal for an instant. The men had no time to scream. Then came the thunder. It began as a murmur, a low groan from the earth itself. Then a sudden, furious roar. The ground heaved upward, splitting open like a wound. The fortress trembled. Towers tilted. Walls folded inward, stones screaming as they fell. 1,000 tons of masonry collapsed into the abyss below, dragging men, banners, and prayers into the void. From afar, it looked as though the castle had exhaled, a sigh of smoke, fire, and ruin rising into the rain. When the sound faded, there was only the soft patter of rain returning. The storm had watched it all in silence. It cleansed nothing. Close at dawn, the survivors walked through the gray mist. The fortress was gone, half sunken, half standing, a carcass of stone. Where towers once touched the sky, there were now only broken arches reaching for ghosts. The rain had turned the ash into rivers, small gray streams that wound through corpses and rubble, carrying away names, faces, vows. Victory had no voice here, only the whisper of wind through collapsed tunnels, the hollow sound of earth reclaiming what men had borrowed. In the ruins, a soldier found the edge of a tunnel, its entrance gaping like the mouth of the dead. He knelt beside it, listening. There was no sound now, no drip of water, no sigh of air, only stillness. Yet, he imagined he could hear something faint beneath the layers of silence, a heartbeat echoing deep in the soil. Perhaps it was memory. Perhaps it was the earth, remembering the hands that shaped it. By nightfall, the battlefield had vanished beneath fog. The survivors lit torches, their flames trembling like the souls they carried. They moved on, to the next siege, the next command, the next hollow promise. From the black earth beneath their boots, the tunnels remained. Veins through the soil, black, empty, endless. They were more than scars of war. They were lessons carved in silence. That victory is a fragile thing, that the earth never forgets what is buried within it. That even in the quietest places, destruction hums like a prayer waiting to be answered. The wind rose again, sweeping through the wreckage, carrying ash across the moors. And for a moment, it seemed the land itself breathed, as though the world had witnessed enough of men digging their own graves in the name of glory. The rain began again, thin and cold, tracing paths through the ruins. It fell upon the shattered stones, upon the open earth, upon the quiet tunnels that once burned with fire. Each drop was a reminder that even silence can be a weapon. And beneath that rain, the last ember died unseen. The wind carried the smell of rotting meat long before the banners appeared. It rolled over the fields and crept through the torn shutters of the city, a sickly wind, thick with secrets. It was not the scent of simple decay. It was deliberate. crafted, a weapon not forged by blacksmiths, but by hunger, cruelty, and patience. The besieging army had found the cruelest tool of all, the corpse. From the ramparts, the defenders watched the enemy's engines creak into position, wooden beasts against the gray sky. The air hung still for a heartbeat, and then came the groan of twisted rope, the whip of release, and the flight of something far too heavy to be stone. A body, bound in linen, mottled and bloated, spun lazily through the air. It glimmered for a brief moment in the dawn before vanishing beyond the wall. Then the thud, soft, wet, final, the sound of death coming home. By midday, the sky was alive with the silhouettes of the damned. Men, women, even the carcasses of animals, all hurled over the walls like blasphemous prayers. Their mouths were sewn shut as if to hold in the secret of their suffering. Their eyes, empty now, seemed to accuse both sides. Inside the city, no one spoke above a whisper. The catapults outside had gone silent, but the work of war had only just begun. Every street reeked of vinegar and rosemary, the desperate perfumes of survival. Physicians, those gaunt, masked figures with bird-like beaks, burned herbs until the air shimmered with smoke. They muttered words to Saint Roch, the patron of plague, as though prayer could block the unseen march of pestilence. But pestilence needs no gate. It walks in a breath. It hides in a grain. It rides on the fur of the rat, small, silent, and patient. The defenders who once feared arrows now feared the simple act of breathing. They covered their faces with cloth soaked in wine, hoping the scent would keep away the death in the air. Each cough was a tolling bell, each fevered sigh a drumbeat of surrender. In the marketplaces where bread once traded for silver, now corpses traded for space. The wells were poisoned by the dead that had fallen near them. The baker's oven burned not with flour-dusted loaves, but with the bodies no one dared bury. The priests moved through the streets like shadows, sprinkling holy water that evaporated before it touched the ground. In the cathedral, the candles burned without pause, each flame a prayer, each flicker a plea. They prayed for deliverance. They prayed for rain. They prayed for silence. But the rain came too late, and the silence they asked for was granted, in full. One night, a young guard stood upon the battlements. His armor was rusted from the mist. His breath came ragged in the cold. He looked out beyond the walls and saw nothing, only fog, rippling faintly with the light of distant fires. And then he heard it, a whispering sound, not of soldiers, not of horses, but of rats. Thousands of them, moving like water beneath the cobblestones, an invisible flood. He dropped his torch and ran. But by morning, his post was empty, his bed untouched. The city began to fold inward. Families sealed themselves in their homes, painting crosses upon their doors. The bell in the chapel tower rang ceaselessly, not for worship, but for counting. Each toll marked a life ended, a story unspoken. And yet, even amidst the despair, there were those who refused to yield. A mother who washed her child's fevered brow with the last of her wine. A monk who tore his robes to bind wounds no one else dared touch. Acts of quiet defiance, soft embers in a world gone cold. Days blurred into weeks. The siege outside slowed, but the siege within grew relentless. Hunger gnawed more fiercely than arrows ever could. Men traded faith for bread, and bread for mercy. Even the ravens grew too fat to fly. When the gates finally broke, there was no battle left to fight. The victors entered cautiously, expecting ambush or defiance. But what greeted them was silence. The streets were lined not with soldiers, but with bones. Windows gaped like the sockets of skulls. In the square, a single statue of the Virgin stood untouched, its stone face streaked with black rain and ash. A soldier dismounted and stepped forward, his boots sinking into mud mixed with ash and flesh. He lifted his visor and inhaled the air of conquest, only to retch. Victory, he realized, had a smell. It was not the scent of triumph, but of rot and rosemary. That night, as fires were lit to cleanse the dead, the wind changed again. It moved through the ruins like a ghost searching for its name. Some swore they heard voices in it, whispers of those who perished, calling for water, for light, for peace. The soldiers who survived the siege would never again sleep easily. They said the wind itself remembered, and when it shifted, it carried not only the scent of herbs and death, but the weight of guilt. Years later, travelers who crossed that field spoke of strange stillness. No birds nested there. No crops took root. Even the air felt heavy, as though burdened by memory. They said if you stood there long enough, you could still smell it, faint but unmistakable, the mingling of rosemary and something darker that no prayer could cleanse. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of siege. Not the broken walls, nor the banners raised in victory, but the silence that follows. A silence that seeps into the soil, into the stones, into the stories we tell ourselves about glory and fate. War, in the end, is not a contest of courage, but of decay. One side rots slower than the other, that is all. And when the last torch burns out, when even the rats have gone, what remains is the echo of breath that once was human. The wind moves on. It carries no allegiance, no pity, no song. Only the memory of what we did here, and what we became when hunger turned our hearts to stone. In the frozen belly of the north, before the first light touched the mountains, silence ruled the valley. Snow lay in brittle sheets upon the timber walls, and breath rose in small ghosts above the helmets of men. Their armor was rimed with frost, their fingers trembling around ropes, pulleys, and the polished faces of strange bronze mirrors. No swords gleamed here, no banners unfurled. Only the engineers moved with purpose, quiet, deliberate, eyes reflecting the pale moon. They whispered among themselves of mathematics and miracles, of a weapon that bore neither blood nor blade. They called it the light of God. At the first breath of dawn, the signal came, a single horn echoing across the valley, mournful as a dying ox. The soldiers stirred, boots crunching against the ice, their forms haloed by mist. Across the ridge, the mirrors stood like sleeping giants, curved and waiting. 1,000 faces of the sun were about to awaken. As the first rays broke through the clouded horizon, the valley shimmered, at first timidly, then fiercely, as if heaven itself had turned its gaze upon the earth. The mirrors caught the light, bent it, multiplied it, until the air itself seemed to waver with heat. Down below, the enemy's siege towers stood proud, hulking wooden beasts, heavy with tar and rope, their ladders bristling like ribs of carcass. The men inside, unaware, watched the frost melt upon their beams and thought it a strange omen. Then came the shimmer. A bright glint, sharp as a blade, danced across the tower's faces. One soldier squinted, shielding his eyes. Another laughed nervously, pointing at the mirage. But in the span of heartbeats, laughter curdled into screams. Smoke rose, thin at first, then wild. The wood blackened, cracked, and within moments, towers that had taken weeks to build were engulfed in flames. Arrows, stacked in bundles, caught the light, igniting midair like fiery birds. Men stumbled from ladders, their shadows devoured by invisible fire. To those who watched from the fortress walls, it seemed divine, a miracle without thunder, a wrath without sound. Some fell to their knees, whispering prayers, believing angels had descended upon their side. Others stared, terrified, not of the enemy, but of what they themselves had unleashed. Behind the ramparts, the commander watched in silence. His face, half lit by the reflection of burning towers, was unreadable. When his aide asked if it was truly God's will that they harnessed, he only murmured, "If it is, then let him judge us later." The valley roared with light, and then, as quickly as it came, it broke. The mirrors cracked, one after another, under the unbearable heat of their own brilliance. Bronze splintered into shards, hissing as they fell into snow. The engineers, frantic, tried to save their instruments, but the glass cut deep, drawing blood that steamed against the cold air. By midday, the smoke had cleared. The siege towers were gone. Nothing left but skeletal remains, black and curling. The air smelled of resin and ruin. And yet, victory was not a song but a whisper. The defenders tended to their wounded, bandaging burned palms and sliced fingers. No one spoke of glory. The priests called it divine intervention, but the engineers knew better. They saw in their broken mirrors not a miracle, but a warning. Because when night fell, vengeance came on wings of fire. The enemy, furious and desperate, struck back with the only light left to them, flame. Arrows tipped in pitch arced through the darkness, tracing brief comets across the sky. Torches hurled from catapults shattered upon the ramparts, spilling rivers of fire down the timber walls. The wind carried sparks like stars torn from heaven, scattering them into the valley where snow melted into mud and blood. The defenders, exhausted and blinded by smoke, fought in silhouettes, their shadows dancing like ghosts upon the walls they swore to protect. A man screamed as his cloak caught fire. Another beat the flames out with his bare hands, the skin peeling away in ribbons. The night was endless, a storm of embers and arrows. In the heart of it, one of the engineers crawled toward the wreckage of his shattered mirror. He cupped a shard in his bleeding palms, the bronze still warm, still reflecting. In its curved surface, he saw his own face twisted and broken, a reflection of the thing he had built. He whispered through chapped lips, "We tried to hold the sun, but the sun, like all gods, demands a price." By dawn, the valley was unrecognizable. Smoke lay low and heavy, the kind that clings to the soul more than the lungs. The timber walls were scarred, black veins running through the frost. The ground was littered with arrows and bones, their shapes softened by ash. The soldiers who remained alive moved like phantoms, dragging bodies, dousing embers, muttering prayers. Above them, the mountains stood in silence, witnesses to both miracle and massacre. And when the commander walked the ramparts, he looked not toward the horizon, but down into the valley below, where the ruins of the enemy's towers still smoldered. The heat from the earth shimmered faintly, and for a fleeting moment, he saw stars reflected in the pools of melted bronze. They looked peaceful, like constellations adrift in another world. He wondered if the stories would tell of light or fire, of divine favor or human folly. He wondered if history would remember the brilliance or the screams. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers asked, "Will we build them again, my lord? The mirrors?" The commander did not answer. He placed a hand upon the cold wood of the rampart, feeling where flame had licked and burned it smooth. "No," he said finally, voice hollow. "We have already seen what heaven looks like when we summon it down." The wind rose, scattering ashes across the valley. The snow began again, slow, deliberate flakes that fell upon charred wood and frozen corpses alike. The light was gone, replaced by the gray stillness of aftermath. And in that silence, the valley became sacred once more, not because of what was won, but because of what was lost. As dawn broke for the second time, faint rays touched the pools of bronze at the valley's heart. They gleamed softly, reflecting not the sun, but the faces of those who would one day return to tell the tale of how men bent light to their will and found only darkness. The mirrors were gone, the signs forgotten, only the myth remained. They would say angels fought there, wielding spears of gold. They would say heaven itself had chosen side. But the truth, buried beneath ice and ash, was that men had once dared to command the sun, and for one brief, blinding hour, they had succeeded. Then the light broke, and everything that followed would be born from its shadow. Snow muffled the world into a silence, so complete it felt as though sound itself had died. The land lay buried beneath white, a motionless ocean of frost and fatigue. Beneath its shroud, men huddled in torn cloaks, eyes hollow, fingers blackened by the cold. They had long forgotten the taste of warmth or the feeling of their own heartbeat that wasn't trembling. Each morning brought no dawn, only another gray veil. The siege had lasted through the seasons, through hunger, through the rot of horses and the smell of smoke frozen into the air. They chewed leather for supper, prayed to saints whose names they barely remembered, and waited for a sign, for a miracle, or for death. In the stillness of one such morning, a sound broke the monotony. Not a cry, not a horn, but the whisper of rumor. A weapon, they said, was coming from the east. Not of steel, nor flame, but of sound. A weapon that could shatter men's minds before their bodies. The desperate listened with trembling faith. The weary laughed, their lips cracking like parchment. But in every soul, something stirred, a sliver of dread, or perhaps hope disguised as terror. The name spread among the ranks like a curse spoken in reverence. The storm organ. They said it was a creation of madmen, blacksmiths, and monks who had forgotten which they were. Pipes of bronze, arranged like the mouth of a great beast, bound upon the frame of a wagon taller than a man. Each pipe filled with powder and shot, tuned not for music, but for ruin. When it fired, it did not sing. It screamed. And so, when it arrived, dragged through the snow by oxen with ribs sharp as spears, the men gathered in silence. They looked upon it as one might look upon a relic from hell. The bronze pipes glinted under a weak sun, their mouths open like the throats of the damned. Even the wind dared not move. The commander, a man whose voice had grown thin from shouting over months of siege, stood before his soldiers and spoke softly. "This is our last prayer," he said, "and it does not ask for mercy." When the day came, the valley was white and wide and waiting. Across from them, the enemy camp bristled with color, banners defiant, drums echoing faintly in the snow. They had held the walls for months, laughing down at the starving men below. Today, they laughed again when they saw the strange contraption wheeled onto the field. "What is this?" they shouted from the towers. "A church organ? A toy?" Their laughter rolled across the ice. But it died quickly. The commander raised his hand. A torch was brought forth, its flame flickering like the last heartbeat of the world. He touched it to the fuses. At first, there was nothing, only the hiss of fire kissing snow. Then, all at once, the air convulsed. It was not thunder. It was not war. It was something older, the sound of creation tearing. The mountains trembled. The sky split open. Men fell to their knees, clutching their heads as though trying to hold their souls inside. The snow did not fall. It leapt. It burst upward, alive and furious, a white storm born from sound alone. Birds in flight dropped like stones. Sentries on the walls screamed, their ears bleeding, their eyes wide with disbelief. It was as if God had struck a chord too loud for the world to bear. The volley lasted but a moment, yet it felt eternal, a symphony of ruin, played by human hands that should never have known such power. When it ended, there was nothing. No cries, no clash of steel, only the settling whisper of snow, falling again upon the dead. The enemy ranks had been torn apart. Men twisted, banners shredded, walls cracked. Even the victors stood stunned, their mouths open in silent horror. The storm organ stood blackened at the heart of the valley, its pipes split and smoking, as if it too had screamed itself to death. No one cheered. No one wept. They simply walked among the fallen, boots sinking into red snow, each step softer than the last, as if they feared to disturb the silence now sacred. One soldier, a boy of perhaps 16, knelt beside a shattered drum. Its skin had torn open, frozen mid-beat. He touched it, and his hand came away gray with ash. His lips moved, whispering something that might have been a prayer or an apology. Above them, the sky hung low and bruised. Smoke rose and mingled with cloud, forming shapes no man dared name. The wind blew once, softly, then stopped, as if reconsidering its purpose. That night, fires burned in the camps, but no one spoke near them. The organ's carcass stood in the distance, silhouetted against the flames like a monument to blasphemy. It had ended the siege. It had brought victory, and yet the victors could not sleep. They said the wind carried echoes, faint, haunting, as though the weapon had left a piece of its voice behind. When men tried to rest, they heard it, a low moan like a choir beneath the earth. Some covered their ears. Others wept without knowing why. By dawn, frost had reclaimed the valley. The snow gleamed like glass, untouched, pure again, as though the night before had been only a dream. But the silence that lay upon that place was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of something wounded, something that would never fully heal. In the years that followed, travelers spoke of strange things, of nights when the wind howled too evenly, as if following a rhythm, of birds avoiding the valley altogether, and of an unshakable chill that clung to the bones of anyone who lingered there too long. They called it the organ's curse. Scholars wrote of acoustics and physics, of resonance and fear. Priests spoke of judgment, of mankind's desire to imitate the voice of God, and the punishment that followed. But those who had heard it, those who had seen the snow leap to life, never spoke of it again. One of the survivors, an old soldier with one good ear and a haunted gaze, was once asked what he remembered most. He did not speak of victory, nor death, nor even the sound itself. He only said, when it ended, the world felt hollow, as if the noise had taken something from it, something we could never get back. And from that winter onward, they say the wind never sang again. It wandered the valleys mute, brushing past the ruins like a ghost that had forgotten its song. And in every hush of snow that falls upon a sleeping field, there lingers, just faintly, the memory of that unholy harmony, a sound that was not of nature nor of man, but of hatred, shaped into music and loosed upon the world. Night fell heavy upon the besieged city. It was not the silence of peace, nor the calm before a storm, but the stillness that comes when the world forgets to breathe. The last of the daylight slipped behind the horizon, swallowed by smoke. From the high towers, archers leaned into the wind, watching torches tremble in the darkness below. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, flickering like constellations of the damned. The enemy encampment breathed with quiet intent. Between the wavering lights, shadows moved. Figures cloaked in oil-black leather, faces veiled, steps deliberate. They bore no banners. No cry of allegiance escaped their lips. Only the faint tearing of parchment, beeswax seals breaking, the sound of secret orders opened beneath the moon. They were the alchemist soldiers, not knights of honor, nor men of mercy. Their loyalty was to flame. From their satchels they drew small clay pots, sealed with wax, the vessels painted with symbols of warning, serpents, suns, and strange letters that once belonged to forgotten tongues. Inside each jar slumbered a liquid that no one dared to name aloud, a fire that fed on water, air, and fear itself. The Greeks had whispered of it centuries before. Now it was reborn in darker hands. As the midnight hour drew near, the defenders on the walls began to whisper prayers, words that turned to steam in the cold night air. Beneath them, the city slept uneasily, wrapped in the smell of tallow candles and damp stone. Mothers pressed rosaries to their lips, children huddled beside their fathers' shields, waiting for dawn. But dawn would not come. A single spark was enough. The first jar shattered against the gate. For an instant, nothing, only a strange hiss like breath escaping from the throat of the earth. Then ignition. The wooden gate blossomed into living light. Fire poured like water, hungry and bright, its touch unnatural. It ran along iron hinges, kissed the stone, and clung to the surface of the moat. The defenders screamed, throwing buckets of water, a reflex born from generations, but the water turned traitor. The flames danced upon it, laughing in ripples of molten gold. Even the rain that followed, summoned by heaven's pity, only made the fire shimmer brighter. Greek fire, the weapon that defied creation itself. A miracle turned curse. On the wall, Captain Renault of the watch covered his mouth with a wet cloth, though it did little. The air reeked of resin and iron, of flesh singed into smoke. Below him, the courtyard had become a lake of light, where men stumbled like ghosts, their armor glowing red before collapsing in silence. The bells tolled, not for alarm now, but for death. Through the haze, the monk appeared, barefoot, robe torn. His hair glistened with soot and sweat. Across his chest hung a small wooden cross, charred at the edges but intact. He moved as though guided by something unseen, past soldiers, past flames, past the weeping faces that blurred into silhouettes. He carried the last relic of the city, a cross carved from the beam of the first chapel ever built on this land. It had survived floods, famines, and wars of faith. Now, it would face the final fire. He reached the cathedral steps, where gargoyles watched like mourners. The stained glass above, once alive with color, now bled orange light. Inside, the choir stalls had already begun to smolder, and the great tapestries curled like parchment. Yet he did not hesitate. He set the cross upon the stone, knelt, and whispered something that no one would ever hear. The flames found him there. For a moment, he was haloed, not in gold, but in the furious glow of annihilation. His shadow stretched behind him, long and thin, until it took the shape of another crucifix, two crosses side by side, one of wood, one of man. Then the roof gave way. Elsewhere, the alchemist's soldiers withdrew, their work complete. They did not cheer. They watched. The city had become a furnace, its streets winding rivers of molten pitch. Every tower, every house, every prayer now burned with the same color. One of them, younger than the rest, paused on the ridge overlooking the inferno. His gloved hand trembled slightly as he reached toward the heat, as though to touch the god he had just unleashed. The commander turned, his voice low and final. "Do not look back," he said. And so they didn't. Behind them, the city screamed once, a long, fractured wail, and then fell silent. When the fire finally surrendered to exhaustion, dawn approached hesitantly, as if afraid of what it might see. Smoke rose in gentle spirals from the ruins, carrying with it the last breath of the dead. The towers were gone. The walls had folded inward, softened by heat. And yet, the bells remained. They hung crooked in the melted frames, blackened, half-melted, but unbroken. When the wind moved through the hollow city, they made no sound. And still, the people who would one day find them swore they could feel a vibration in the air, as though the metal remembered what it once meant to sing. Beneath the ash, the ground was still warm. Clay shards, the remnants of the alchemist's jars, smoked faintly, their inscriptions cracked but legible. Strange symbols that seemed to pulse in the light, alive even now. They called it the night when water burned. And somewhere, far beyond the ruined gate, the survivors walked barefoot into the wilderness, eyes red, hands empty, carrying only the memory of fire. Some said they saw omens in the smoke, faces, wings, a great serpent devouring its own tail. Others whispered that the monk's cross had not turned to ash, but had sunk beneath the stone, waiting. For what? None could say. In time, grass would grow where the market once stood. The river would carve new paths through the charred soil. Children yet unborn would hear tales of a cursed city and of men who summoned fire from the depths of the sea. But for those who had seen it, for those who had heard the laughter of flame upon water, There would always remain a silence between their words, a fear that light itself could betray them. And when they spoke of faith, they did so softly, as if afraid the heavens might remember. The camera drifts upward, over ruins, over smoke, over the silent bells frozen in their towers. The dawn light spills through the haze, fragile, almost merciful. In the distance, a single crow circles above the wreckage, crying into the emptiness. The fire is gone, but its echo, its memory, still burns. For in every age, there are those who believe they can command the elements. Yet every age must learn. The price of mastering fire is to become its fuel. The morning began with the tolling of bells, not for prayer, but for warning. Each strike rolled through the valley like a heartbeat trembling through fog. From the fortress walls, men peered into the gray distance, their breath visible in the chill, their faces hollow from sleepless nights. Across the misted plain, the enemy camp lay silent. No banners stirred. No horses whinnied. Even the smoke from their fires had vanished. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. For days, the besiegers had thundered with drums and horns, their cries echoing against stone. But now there was only stillness, a silence too perfect to trust. It was the kind of silence that precedes storms, the kind that weighs upon the chest. The defenders watched and waited, hearts beating like trapped birds. Then movement. Small figures appeared, pushing wooden carts through the mist. Slow, deliberate, each wheel groaning against frozen mud. From above, they looked like coffins on wheels, heavy, rectangular, draped in hides soaked dark with moisture. No sound came from the men who guided them. Their faces were wrapped in cloth, their hands gloved. The carts inched closer, toward the wall, toward the gates where the archers held their bows in trembling hands. At first, no one understood. The carts were too small to breach walls, too plain for siege engines, too slow to be traps. But then, a faint sound began, strange, uneven, almost musical. A hum, low and restless, carried by the wind. It grew as the carts neared. The soldiers squinted into the fog, their fingers tightening around bowstrings. The humming deepened, a living vibration, until the air itself seemed to shiver. Then the hides were torn away. What lay beneath was not weaponry of iron or fire, but cages. Dozens of them, each packed tight with trembling shapes that caught the light. Wings, thousands of wings. Bees, hornets, wasps. Hives ripped from the forest, bound with rope and straw. The cages quivered like breathing chests, alive with fury. For a moment, even the defenders did not move. Then the attackers raised their spears and struck the cages open. The sound that followed was not human. A scream of wings burst from the carts, swirling upward like black smoke. The swarm rose as one body, fluid, formless, yet purposeful. It twisted through the air, blotting out the sun, descending upon the battlements in a storm of stings and fury. The first man to fall did not even cry out. He simply dropped his bow, clawing at his eyes as if blinded by flame. Another stumbled backward, tumbling from the parapet into the courtyard below. Horses screamed. Torches fell, scattering sparks. Within minutes, the fortress was chaos, a storm within walls. The air turned thick and alive. Men swung their swords at nothing, cutting only wind and pain. The buzzing grew unbearable, a ceaseless chorus that seemed to fill the skull, drowning thought, drowning fear itself. Smoke rose from smoldering torches as men tried to burn the insects away, but the fire only drew more of them. They poured through windows, through arrow slits, through the cracks in doors, filling every hollow place that once held air. Inside the great hall, the commander tore at his armor, shrieking. The bees crawled beneath the plates, stinging the flesh beneath. He tore free his cuirass and breastplate, flinging them aside like burning chains. His men fled through the corridors, their cries echoing down the stairwells. The chapel, once a place of prayer, became a tomb of wings and echoes. The candles there flickered out as if smothered by invisible hands. Outside, beneath veils of smoke and cloth, the besiegers advanced. They moved as shadows do, quiet, patient, inevitable. Their faces were covered, their eyes narrowed against the living storm. They stepped over fallen men who still twitched beneath their armor, crossing the moat on hastily built planks, their boots sinking into the blood-slick earth. The gates, left half-barred, gave way under the weight of silence. No one guarded them now. The swarm had done what no catapult or ram could. It had broken courage itself. The invaders entered not as conquerors, but as mourners walking through ruin. The city burned without flame. By nightfall, the swarm had found new homes. Within rafters, in wells, behind tapestries. They nested in the thatch above, sleeping quarters, in cracks of stone, in the very mouths of helmets abandoned on the ground. The fortress had become a hive, a breathing labyrinth of venom and memory. Days turned to weeks. The invaders moved on, taking what they could, leaving what they feared. No one dared linger long. The sound of wings haunted every corridor. Even in sleep, soldiers dreamed of that hum, of the black veil that had descended upon them. Those who survived the stings found their skin mottled and their minds unsteady, as though something of the swarm had taken root inside them. When spring came, the valley filled with green again, but no birds nested near the walls. Travelers who passed by told stories of the humming fortress, how at dusk, when the light slanted through the arrow slits, one could see clouds of insects rising like incense. They said the air there was heavy with old breath, and that sometimes the hum sounded almost like words. No banners flew from the towers anymore. No fires burned in the courtyards. Yet from afar, the fortress still seemed alive, as if watching, as if waiting. Years passed. Rain smoothed the stone. Ivy crept where blood once ran. The hum persisted, softer now, like a whisper carried by wind. Locals claimed that those who slept near the ruins woke with dreams of wings brushing their skin, of dark figures pressing upon their chest. Some said it was curse, others justice. A punishment not from men, but from the world itself, weary of their endless wars. Because this was no act of strategy. It was desperation, the kind of madness born when hunger and fear mix in the hearts of men. The besiegers had long exhausted their fire and stone. They had nothing left but the wild, the untamed. And in turning to nature, they had unleashed something beyond their control. The fortress had been built by hands that believed walls could keep the world at bay. But stone cannot keep out the wind, nor can iron silence the hum of living things. When the swarm came, it was as though the earth itself had risen to remind them of that truth, that man's dominion is only a fragile illusion. And so the legend grew. Children whispered it at night, of the army that fought with bees instead of blades, of the castle where silence hums. The elders spoke of how, when cruelty ripens, nature will answer, not with mercy, but with balance. In time, even memory faded. Maps forgot the name of the valley. Only the wind remembered, carrying that faint echo through grass and hollow stone. On certain nights, when the moon hung low and pale, wanderers swore they could hear it again, a sound too soft to fear, too ancient to ignore. The tolling of bells, the whisper of wings, and in that sound lived the story of all sieges, how every fortress falls, not by the enemy's hand, but by the weight of its own silence.